In 1995, an American man took it upon himself to single-handedly challenge the entire post-industrial truth regime. Theodore Kaczynski sent bomb threats to mainstream media institutions, along with a demand to publish his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. These were not the ramblings of a deranged terrorist, however, but rather the most pungent critique of industrial society since its emergence, conceived by a 167 IQ genius. The New York Times and Washington Post responded by printing the essay in its entirety, marking the birth of an ideological movement that would later gain notoriety under the name anarcho-primitivism. This two-part series is intended to cover the major points of analysis in Kaczynski's manifesto. This video will explore his psychological deconstruction of contemporary leftism, which he identifies as symptomatic for the deeply troublesome state of our society. The second video will highlight his assessment of the negative relationship between technology and human freedom. Kaczynski defines contemporary leftists mainly as socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminists, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists and the like. What these fragmented groups all have in common though are two psychological tendencies: feelings of inferiority and over-socialization. The former is a trait that is often found in hypersensitive minority rights activists who seek to radically limit speech that they deem to be offensive. He identifies low self-esteem and powerlessness as the origin for these zealous positions. To find up-to-date examples for this sort of behavior, one must look no further than to Black Lives Matter or LGBT activists who continually obstruct discourse in the name of social justice. The most extreme activists among them are overwhelmingly university-educated, white heterosexual upper-middle-class males who defend minority groups precisely because they see them as inferior and therefore identify with them. He attributes a postmodern mentality to them as they constantly deconstruct anything that is strong, good and successful, such as Western civilization itself. Leftists lack confidence in their own ability and therefore seek to construct a society in which the state takes care of everyone. The concept of competition goes against their intrinsic nature because they feel like losers. Leftists fight against the fabric of reality itself because they cannot bear the fact that human behavior and abilities are genetic. Any group that ends up in an inferior position within society therefore is not to be held accountable for their actions, but rather society at large. Kaczynski concludes that leftists have a deficit in their sense of power and self-worth, but they can still conceive of themselves as having the capacity to be strong. This, however, is only the case in the framework of large movements or groups, because the leftists cannot conceive of themselves as individually strong and valuable. A perfect example for this would be Antifa, a terrorist organization that engages in street violence, but only in the context of large anonymous groups. The high levels of hostility present in the leftist activist type are intended to satisfy their emotional needs for power. This became apparent during the American race riots this year, in which Antifa was heavily involved. Acts of violence and destruction in the name of racial justice actually create more hatred towards the group in whose name these acts are committed. The leftist activists do not believe in the surface level issues they purport to care about. They are merely a way for them to cope with their frustration. As Kaczynski put it, if our society had no social problems at all, the leftists would have to invent problems in order to provide themselves with an excuse for making a fuss. The latter trait, over-socialization, applies to people who cannot think, feel or act within the moral framework of their society without experiencing feelings of guilt and inadequacy. If a child is raised by excessive moral shaming, they will likely develop self-hatred. A common phenomenon that can be observed in Western education systems is the wide prevalence of white guilt and post-colonial narratives that create a situation of over-socialization. Western children grow up ashamed of aspects of their identity that they cannot change, such as ancestry or skin color. These children are often so over-socialized that they cannot even experience unclean thoughts that go against the accepted moral narrative of the Western truth regime. Kaczynski therefore proposes that the most zealous leftists, such as university intellectuals, are also the most over-socialized people in our society. Leftists might be perceived as rebels, but in reality they are the most radical supporters of the system, to such an extent even that they start to accuse the system itself of failing its own moral framework. Liberal democracy, the predominant ideology of the Western world, cements the belief in equality as one of its moral principles. Leftists tend to critique this system not because they disagree with its premise, but because it is taking equality not far enough. Communism is therefore their preferred form because it is the reductio ad absurdum of democratic morality. Another example in the manifesto is the American left's struggle for black empowerment. In reality, this is an attempt by them to integrate the African American community into the industrial system by making them conform to white middle-class ideals, such as holding a respectable job, climbing the status ladder, being a responsible parent, and so forth. The leftists are so pathologically over-socialized that even when they break with the norms of society, for example when they commit violence, they do it in the name of mainstream values, such as fighting for racial equality. Kaczynski therefore concludes that leftism is the result of a society that increasingly socializes its population. Furthermore, he describes the dangers of leftism resulting from this specific psychology. Leftists are intrinsically collectivist and only care about satisfying their need for power. They seek to bind the world together into a unified whole. This can only be achieved by removing human freedom through the centralization of technology. Leftists may pretend to oppose power structures, but history has shown that they will only do this until they capture the systems of social control for themselves. This was the case in the Soviet Union, or even more recently in Western academia. As outsiders, they opposed censorship, but once they took control, they re-implemented it stricter than ever before. Kaczynski points out that leftism is a sort of religion because its adherents need to believe in it, otherwise the entire psychological self-conception will fall apart. By convincing themselves that their inferior slave morality is in fact the moral high ground, they create an emotional dependency that cannot be broken by mere facts and logic. He also identifies this aspect as the cause for the totalitarian tendencies in leftism. Leftists can never be satisfied as their true intentions are the gain of power. Even if society would satisfy all of their current desires, within a few years the leftists would again succumb to their desire to complain about non-issues just to impose their solutions on others. Because of their high levels of socialization, the leftists cannot pursue power in a normal way. They have to force their morality onto others. Their belief in the greater movement is so strong that especially weaker leftist types can never doubt it in public, even if they disapprove of its actions in private. Again, one can look at the George Floyd riots of this year, where the leftist mainstream media in particular would outright deny any acts of violence and looting committed by so-called peaceful protesters. Kaczynski identifies collectivism, social engineering, and a disdain for any form of competition as leftist characteristics. The most dangerous type, according to him, however, are over-socialized crypto-leftists. They tend to work under the cover of bourgeois methods towards achieving their ideologically and psychologically motivated goals. Groups that often fall into this category tend to be bureaucrats, journalists, teachers and lecturers that are true believers in a collectivist ideology. Ted Kaczynski's great achievement in his ideological deconstruction is the conclusion that leftism should rather be classified as a mental condition instead of a coherent political movement. When viewed from this perspective, a lot of absurd positions held by leftists suddenly make sense. They never intend to solve issues reasonably, but rather aim to satisfy their pathological need for power. Ultimately, this is the reason why leftism is a dangerous totalitarian force that always ends up being incompatible with human freedom. How industrialized society creates the leftist psychology and its overall impact on the future of human society will be covered in the next video. Stay tuned for that by subscribing on YouTube, BitChute or on Library. We have a community server on Discord now, feel free to check it out. Link in the description.